In this presentation, we're going to look at what I'm calling Roman political landscapes, sort of environments where Roman politicians would be at home and would do their work. And so we're going to look at this through a number of ways. We're going to look at public space. We're going to look at the Roman Forum and focusing particularly on the Senate House or the Curia, the rostrum or the podium for orating. We're going to look at a couple of early Republican temples, and we will look at basilicas, courthouses, and the Circus Maximus, which I always associate with triumphs. Then we're going to switch and look a little bit at Roman nomenclature and how that kind of signifies political activity, and then even houses, domestic quarters, and how even that seems to, in the Roman world, everything is sort of bound up in the political life with running for office. Think of it that way. And as you see in the chapter, we do focus on this. Why is the question? In one respect, Roman politics maybe most resembles that of contemporary society. They turn political affairs into a process that is recognizable to us. And so it's worth dwelling on it a little bit that way. I think, if anything, this is one of the things the Romans were able to communicate. Or shall we say, we find relevant. We find relevant with their way of life. So what we're looking at here is a drawing of the area of the old Roman Forum at its peak at the time of Constantine, 316-12 AD, when he moved the capital to Byzantium, at which point public building essentially diminished in the city of Rome. And the map down to the left is providing the Republican area within the Servian walls and on the shores of the Tiber, closest place to the shore where it was passable. And it's about 10 miles. Rome is about 10 to 12 miles inland from the Mediterranean Sea. Some features we need to stress, and I did this in the other lecture as well, but we divide Roman chronology into three periods. Royal Rome, which is sort of a mythological period that is confirmed in its substance archaeologically, 753 to 510 BC. In 510 BC, they expelled their last king. I got him there, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or the Proud, in 510 BC. And the oligarchy, and this was a conservative revolution, declared itself a republic or a res publica, public weal. What they meant was they were taking over from the kings, and the society politically was organized along the same lines that we saw in Greece. There is a board of executive magistrates, the 2 consuls, and the 10 tribunes. There is a council of elders. There is the Senate, which comes from the word senex, old man. And there is an assembly of warriors. And we have the centuriate as well as the plebeian assemblies. So the only trick is there are 2 competing governments, shall we say, at Rome. And this is the Roman Republic. 510 to 27 BC, Rome went from being a city-state, arguably the largest city-state in the peninsula of Italy in 500 BC, to becoming the capital of a world empire, the entire Mediterranean world, by 27 BC. And what we can say is that the political structure which the Romans designed to manage a city-state was somehow applicable, transferable, adaptable to world empire, at least until around 133 BC, when the empire became too much for such a small bureaucracy, a relatively small bureaucracy. Something had to give, and so the Romans moved in the direction of autocratic rule. And with that, we get to the first Roman emperor, Augustus. Octavian, the great-grandnephew of Julius Caesar, became the first princeps of Rome and started this process where it was more what we might call a constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless. 27 BC to 476 AD is the traditional end date, I think, when Constantine moved the capital to Byzantium in 315, 316 AD. We're already kind of turning the page in that regard. So I've mentioned the boards of magistrates. The aristocratic government appointed these 2 chief magistrates, the 2 consuls, and their job was to preside over the assemblies, preside over the Senate, pass legislation, but primarily to conduct the armies at war. And Rome was always at war in the Republic, so they could look forward to that, shall we say. There were also these 10 tribunes, or civil liberties protectors, is how I view them, although they ultimately became recognized as magistrates as well. The tribunes' role, because of this innate aura they had, sacrosanctitas, their persons were inviolable during their year in office. They could intervene against harsh judgments by the oligarchic or the aristocratic wing of the government. And simply by extending their sacrosanct nature to people, they could save them through auxilium. They could veto any public actions. They could they could hold elections, and they could prevent elections. And so, like I said, their job was to make sure that the people's will was being heard as well as the oligarchy's will. And so we had this divided government in this regard. Assemblies, there was the Centuriate Assembly. This is the census-based assembly, the purpose of which was to have the wealthiest people with the most armaments available for the draft. And all Roman citizens were eligible for the draft for a minimum of 16 years of compulsory service. The plebeian assembly arose from a rebellion by the army at one point due to harsh judgments by the oligarchy during the Republic, and right off 499 BC. And so it was organized, we might say, a little more democratically. It was organized according to where you lived. There were 35 tribes. You would vote as a tribe, and that would carry the vote of a tribe. You only need 18 out of 35 to carry a measure. So it was a more convenient way to pass legislation, shall we say. But what we know is that the tribes were kind of jerry-rigged. Big surprise there that such a mechanism goes back to antiquity. And that wealthy people living out in the distant rural areas, by and large, had more, their votes counted more than the poor people living in the city, shall we say. It was jerry-rigged in that manner. And so I mentioned the struggle of the orders. This was this dispute. It went on a long time, and it was the dispute for non-patrician aristocrats to gain full access to the offices, because again, you get elected to office and then you enter the Senate for life. You must get elected to office and then you enter the Senate for life. And so this juggling went on for 200 years. And out of this came a bureaucracy of elected offices. So an ascending thresholds of offices. The quaestors, you would begin when you were 30 years old, and it was a financial office in that way. The curule aediles managed the public weal, sort of like our Secretary of the Interior. But they had power to adjudicate market affairs, things like this, and they threw the great games, and that gave them a lot of popularity that way. The praetors, these were the men who had to have judicial power and knowledge, because they would determine whether lawsuits were actionable and assign it to a court and a jury. So they sort of, in a way, our grand jury works. They would determine whether something was worthy of a lawsuit and then direct it in that way. And as Rome conquered the Mediterranean, these men would spend the second year as governors of Roman provinces. So we say their power was prorogued, and they would be governors. And then finally, the consuls, the commanders-in-chief, they enjoyed imperium, which is basically a religious power, the right to consult the auspices as to whether it was meet with the gods to do any public action. But it meant that they had the power of life and death. They commanded the armies. They could deal with any mutiny, anything that got in the way of the Roman people. And so they were the most powerful. But there were two, and they could veto each other. This is called the cursus honorum, the race for the honors. People would begin at the age of 30 as quaestor. There would be maybe 10 of them, depending on what we're talking about. They would go through their careers attempting to gain higher office, because the higher your office is like the military, the more prestige you had in the Senate, the more authority you had with the people, the more auctoritas you had in the Senate itself. And it would get to 8. You think of it this way: every year there are 10 quaestors being elected, but only 8 praetors. So 2, if you're assuming they all run, 2 are going to be out. And then by the time you were 42, you could seek the consulship. Only 2 would get elected. So 10 quaestors would get winnowed down to 2 consuls. This is the cursus honorum. It was a winnowing effect, and it generated and encouraged the most ambitious, the most ruthless, shall we say, of political types. It was intensely competitive. The purpose seems almost being to have channeled this energy, channeled all the violent energies of Rome out into the command of the army and directing against foreign hosts, where it could do less damage to the people of Rome itself. And so in a way, we can say it channeled it out, and it's what made the Roman Empire. But it's that kind of ambition right there that spread into this. And young men, if you were from an aristocratic family, from the time you were present of mind, you would be made aware of your future responsibilities. You seeking the Senate, seeking office, entering the Senate, passing legislation, hearing court disputes, speaking on behalf of people in the courts, speaking in the Senate, serving in the military up through the ranks, and ultimately becoming the consul and ennobling your family. The struggle of the orders created a system by which patricians or plebeians, everybody could be recognized as an aristocrat if you were descended from families that had attained the consulship at some time in their past. We call this the consular nobility. And so what are we saying ultimately? Well, 2 things here. I got to mention dual polity, the fact that we've got this plebeian element that can do things, and the patrician element, or the aristocratic element, the wealthier elements that could do things. 2 assemblies, 2 sets of magistrates functioning at the same time is known as dual polity. It's a form of checks and balances, and it was up to the Senate, which had no genuine authority, to mediate between these 2 branches, to avoid what we would call constitutional crises, gridlock, a panic because there is no solution to a problem. And the first time we really see significant gridlock was 88 BC, the outbreak of the first civil war between Gaius Marius and Lucius Sulla. So it held for quite a while. And we owe that to this amazing abilities, comprehension of the members of the Roman Senate, the sum total of all wisdom and experience politically at Rome. So, as I say here, it was an oligarchic rule, but it was an electoral system. These oligarchs would have to repeatedly put themselves out there in public and seek re-election. So you had to demonstrate your worth, rising up through an ascending series of ranks, and you had to renew your good graces with the voting public again and again and again. And so in a way, that's what's similar maybe to today. That the Greek system, you enter the council for life. In this system, no, you had to keep getting out there, testing your strength, and surviving the winnowing process. And so it kind of kept things a little more honest, we might think, and made it more of a what I call a political environment or a political society, as we'll see. So we begin with the Roman Forum. This is the town square. It is the center of Rome, and so we have to look at it from, a religious perspective. This is where all the great temples were, so that you would invoke the gods, and they would be present while people did public activities, whether it's commercial, judicial, political, electoral, what have you. In that regard, there were political buildings as well, and sort of commercial buildings as well. So we'll take a look at that. From a senator's perspective, the most important place undoubtedly was the Senate House itself. This is the Curia, actually of Caracalla, but the Curia Julia. It was burned down several times. The people got angry with the Senate on more than one occasion, and its position changed over time as well. It survives today, the latest phase, because it was converted into a church, as many of the buildings in Rome survived because of the Christian conversions, and they were reutilized, repurposed in that way. And this is where senators would meet and debate. They were under the direction of a magistrate, a consul, or praetor, or a tribune who could convene them. And they would debate all day, and then they would do the divisio. They would vote with their feet. They would move to one side or the other side of the chamber. Upper right, we have a French 19th century painter showing the dispute where Cicero harangues against Catiline and exposes him for being a conspirator against Rome. Catiline sitting all alone there. But the problem is it's showing a European parliamentary seating system. The lower left kind of shows you it was just two banks of two rows, sort of like the British parliamentary system, and you would vote by moving to one side or the other. This is the ambition of the Roman aristocrat, is to be a member of this, and not just be a member. If you were somebody who didn't hold offices beyond the consulship, I mean the quaestorship, for example, you would never be allowed to speak. Rarely. You wanted to be an ex-praetor or an ex-consul because they were the ones who would be allowed to speak. In public, how do you address the people? Well, there was the rostrum, the speaker's platform, and we can see the brick remains of the one that was constructed by Augustus and revetted with marble. It had the ship speaks from the Battle of Antium in 338 BC on its facade. Most of the forum is kind of like the mall in Washington. It is a place for monuments of Roman warfare and sacrifice in that regard. And the location of this moved repeatedly. Originally, it sort of faced the Senate House so that the tribunes could speak right at the Senate House, shouting at it. But once the Republic was over, it just became sort of a ceremonial structure. Roman temples, I mean, I was going to say, yes, many of these Roman politicians were also priests. There were the priests that were the augurs who would look to the skies to determine whether it was okay to hold the public assembly. And there were the pontifices who, when there was some disturbance from the skies, the heavens, they would have to consult the sacred books and come up with a solution, how to appease the gods. And these were political. People were co-opted into these, as there was an opening, some would get co-opted, yes. But there also are these temples because of the nature of public life. The gods have to be invoked and be witnesses to public activity. And so I'm just showing you two 4th century temples. The Temple of Saturn, which also functioned in the back of it as the Roman mint. So this is where Romans struck coins, and that was an early magistracy, was to hold the 3 men of the mint and strike coins for the Roman Republic. And then down below, the Temple of Castor and Pollux. These were both on the west side of the forum, one on the northern end, one on the southern end of it. Temple of Castor and Pollux concerns a battle. Supposedly the gods came and predicted to the Romans that they were worried about what's going on out in the front, and these gods came and informed them that the Romans had won. And then the word came, and so they decided it must have been Castor and Pollux watering their horses. But it became a kind of a flashpoint. It was a center, especially in the late Republic, where demagogic politicians would rally their mobs to attack the Senate and things like this. It may even be that they stored rocks and things like this to throw at people during those tumultuous times there in the Temple of Castor and Pollux. Speaking of temples, though, we need to focus on the other aspect of it as well, and this gets into Roman aristocratic women. They had far more prestige here than they did in the Greek world. Roman women, especially matronly, virtuous, matronly women who maintained the households and helped their families get into the political life, if they were unhappy with affairs in Rome, we see this already by the time of the Hannibalic War, they could just wade out en masse into the forum and demand change. And people wouldn't question them because these were the great, respectful women of Rome. And so one of the highest offices they could hold was a religious office, the Temple of Vesta. Young women, virgins, were selected from the top aristocratic families to maintain the eternal flame of Vesta in this temple. We have a drawing here of the chief Vestal priestess, and they lived in a villa, and there you see the remains of it right beside the temple to maintain their chastity in that regard. Roman basilicas, these don't come into being until the 3rd century BC, and they seem to be based on a Hellenistic model, possibly from Alexandria, what was known as the Stoa Basilica. which would have been a portico, but these were porticos basically arranged in a rectangle facing inward and put a roof over it. So you're creating interior space. So it's basically a ground floor colonnade with a clear story. And you can see the Christian Basilica of St. Paul beyond the walls right there in the middle. And you can see the effect of the clear story. It creates this big open space. It has the ability to kind of dissipate noise. It has its own climate as well. And why were these essential? As Rome became an empire, the business of Rome had to go on, regardless of whether it was raining or snowing or what have you. And so it was the need to have interior space to conduct business. So we know that commerce occurred here. Bankers would kind of set up little tables between and rope off columns so they could set up their offices there. But also we hear that it was a center for tribunals, for court proceedings, and it became a emblematic building of Roman rule. All major provincial headquarters have a basilica, at least one. Corinth had two, in order for the Roman law to occur there, and it becomes the symbol, really, of Roman law. And then another feature that you would associate with Roman senators, especially the successful generals, is the Circus Maximus. So if a Roman general was successful in the field, he would have his army declare him a triumphing Roman general. He would send an embassy of witnesses and his officers back to Rome, to the Senate, to demonstrate that he had won a major victory and ask if he could have a parade. And they would give him leave to have a parade. And his army, on the last day of his imperium, they would enter the city in a parade. They would march up the sacred way through the Forum, up to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. He would perform sacrifices. He would ride on this amazing chariot, dressed like Jupiter for the day, and then they would ride and march back out, and he would hold maybe a week of public games, races, exotic animal hunts. He would feed the public and give them free wine, spend his booty on the public, and that would kind of cement him as one of the greatest Roman politicians of his day and plow the earth for the next generation. The Romans were always thinking about, what about the next generation? The legacy of their families, how to perpetuate their political success. It's just ingrained in them in that way. And that leads to the issue personally with Roman senators. What were they like? As I said, the Romans, as I tried to explain, highly organized people. And so they developed a kind of peculiar nomenclature. It's epitomized in this regard. They give the tria nomina, the three Roman names. So we have the first name, known as the praenomen. You can see there, it would simply be abbreviated: M for Marcus, L for Lucius, Sext for Sextius, Q for Quintus, D for Decimus. I'm just giving you some examples. There are about 12 that were regularly used, kind of commonly. But it's interesting that if you look there, Quintus, right? Sextus, Decimus. I mean, these are numbers. These are numbers. The Roman paterfamilias, the head of the household, determined whether a child born in his household was legitimately his child or not. He had absolute power over his family. And his family, familia, it's not just nuclear family. Extended family plus the slaves and servants living on his estate. And so in a way, he had the power of life and death. In the same, and he's known as the paterfamilias, the head of the household, in the same way that the consul had imperium, and so it's kind of ingrained that way. And he's giving his kids numbers as names, number 1, number 2, number 6, number 5, number 10. Just saying. Nomen, this is the family name. It's associated with a gens, a clan, an extended clan, who all claim descent back to some particular ancestor, right? For the patricians, they claim descent from an ancestor descended from the gods. That's why they were patricians. The gods would naturally speak to them because they were descended from. Julius Caesar was a patrician, okay? And so the middle name is the name you pay attention to. Julius, the Julian family, descended from Iulus, the son, grandson of Aeneas, right? Cornelius, Licinius, Pompeius, Fabius. These tell you the big families. in that regard. And then the third name, the cognomen, is, I call it a heraldic epithet. These families start to branch off over time, and some branches became more famous than others, and they earned heraldic epithets to distinguish them from their relatives, basically, but distant cousins, shall we say. So we hear Julius Caesar. Okay, comes from the Latin verb caedo, caedere, to be cut. His ancestor was cut from the womb of his mother through cesarean birth. Scipio, Lucius Publius Cornelius Scipio. Here's an interesting one. Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus means fat. Okay. Fabius, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Which branch of the Fabii? The Maximi, the greatest branch, right? There's a kind of arrogance. There's a kind of an arrogance being emitted by many of these names, except some of them are kind of pejorative, and we'll get to that. How would it be displayed? There you see the formal nomenclature of Julius Caesar. Gaius, Julius, CF, son of Gaius, Gai Filius, CN, Gai Nepos, grandson of Gaius, Caesar. Right there, we can identify 3 generations of Roman descent. Him, his father, and his grandfather. Roman nomenclature, and they would get it because they would have to register as citizens when they turned 18 for the draft. And so you would be recorded this way. Also would be included is your tribal designation for your voting purposes. Which district were you from? And so there you go. You know, how should I put it? I'm thinking of list. We had the list of all the consuls of the Republic. It was actually put on a plaque of marble. It got shattered, but a lot of it survives. And it lists these people. And so from the list and the records, we're actually able to construct lineage of these families for 200 years at a time, in the case of the Fabii and families like that. Father, son, father, son, father, son, this way. This whole notion of ancestors and family lineage is so incredibly important to the Romans, much more so than any other people, shall we say, of the Mediterranean, except the royal families, perhaps, in that regard. And so that's the point I was making was Fabius Maximus African. Scipio, Publius Scipio defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, and so he was awarded the cognomen Africanus for winning this war in North Africa. So in the late Middle Republic, we get, you know, these guys adding things like Asiaticus, Africanus, I'm thinking somebody else, Bellericus. I mean, you know, I'm the one who conquered all of Africa. I mean, you got to imagine the infatuousness of the mindset of these people as they take on these outrageous, outlandish awards, shall we say. But as I said before, Marcus Licinius Crassus, Licinius the Fat. All right. We have Rufus, the redhead, Barbus, the bearded one. We've got Carbo, the dark-skinned one. We've got this Publius Mucius Scaevola, the classic example. The story is that this young ancestor of this family, captured by the king of Rome, who was trying to retake the city, he put his hand into the hearth and pulled out an ember and let it burn right in his left hand. And so it meant left hand. Like, if you go ahead and torture me, all your efforts are going to have no more matter than what I'm doing to myself right now. But there's another etymology to this word, and it means erect male sex organ. So which was it, right? One of the points I'm trying to make here is that sometimes it looks like the public would hurl names, abusive names, to politicians, and they would stick, and they would be taken and utilized because it helped to create the all-essential aspect of name recognition. In electoral political systems, name recognition was everything. If you don't have a cognomen, it means you're some sort of new man. You've got to come from one of these great families. And I always say, boy, you know, LBJ, JFK, dynastic families like the Clintons or the Bushes or the Roosevelts, what have you. What is it about name recognition in electoral systems that the public seems to thrive on it this way. There's something very similar in this regard. And so they would take on even sort of pejorative names if it helped promote their political chances over time. Some more about nomenclature. So here we can actually see, this is on the left, you have this is a burial, eulogy, or what we would call a funeral relief. And so it says Gaius Cornelius, son of Gaius Volt. That's the abbreviation for the tribal designation. Calvus, he's Calvus, and he lived together with himself. And he mentions his brother, and may their shades be honored in the afterlife. There's a coin there, and right on the coin, the guy who struck it, he put his name, Gaius Mummius, and CF. Again, designating his name in a visible way so that people could see it. And even in the early empire, we have the Pantheon, which originally was a traditional gable-styled Roman temple put up by the son-in-law and general of Augustus. Vipsanius, that was his first name, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa is what it says, consul for the third time, Fecit, made this thing. But again, there's the nomenclature. The nomenclature just flashes at you like billboards in the Republican era. And then I want to do a little bit about portraiture, because the merger that occurs between Rome and the Greek world is occurring right at the peak of this movement we discussed before in Hellenistic art. So you think of all the attributes of Hellenistic art, the pathos, the emphasis on an everyman, the idealization in some ways of the human anatomy and the human experience. While showing the essence of it in lower class people. In Rome, they had a similar but different sort of tradition, and that was the tradition of the wax death mask, or imagines. Roman portraiture descended from this tradition of preserving wax death masks of famous Roman senators, which they would take out in funerals, and actors would wear them and do pantomime to remind, as the family marched in a procession, to remind the public of the greatness of that family. They've lost a great member of the family, haul out all the ancestors and bring them along. And the young boys of the family would have to memorize every one of these masks. They would be in the alcove, the entryway to the house. Even the house was sort of organized for this political entourage, this procession, shall we say. But the Romans were really into realistic portraiture of their appearance. They believed that every wrinkle, every wart, every scar represented their human, what's the word for it? We call it virtus in Latin, and it means that male experience, the courage, strength, experience. You've been tested over time. And so Romans clients would go to these Greek sculptors and say, I want you to sculpt me just as I am. Just as I am. And so, interestingly, and we can see on the left there is an unnamed Roman senator holding the bust of his ancestors, once again. Then we've got this, presumably a senator there in the middle, in the dark there, with his face just so full of expression. And, that guy's been through a lot, let's just face it. And the other two there are from Delos. One is a banker, we think. The other one is a Roman general this way. And it's just something not as idealized in Roman portraiture. And it must have been hard for Greek sculptors to figure out, what is it these guys really want? They really want me to show the wrinkles or the scar or whatever it is this way. And so it's interesting. It's just an interesting phenomenon. It does suggest that the portraits that survive of these famous Romans, Marius or Caesar or Pompey, are based on something, approximation of what they really look like. I think portraiture in the Roman world is far more likely to be what they look like than in other societies, shall we say. And last, we look at the Roman house. It's kind of similar to the peristyle house of the Greek world, but not really. There is a great central hall that was visible and accessible from the doorway. So you're looking at the doorway in the upper left. You could look in across this atrium, this raised area in the middle, with a very narrow aperture that could be closed. They had like a door they could pull closed, or they could throw tarps across it, something like that, in the wintertime to keep the elements out. But also it was this behind the central impluvium where they would collect rainwater from the roof would be the tablinum, or the place where the Roman senator would sit when he was presiding, holding office. I mean, holding hours, business hours. They would open the doors to the outside, and his clients would come in a queue to ask him for favors. Again, think of kind of the Roman movie The Godfather, and the Undertaker that comes in. His daughter's been raped, and he had ignored the Godfather, but now he has to get vengeance, and so he comes for the Godfather uh, and asks for a favor. And later he will have to bury the Godfather's son. Yeah, it's just so Roman. This is so Roman, the way that Pucci portrayed all this. And again, it suggests that the mafia sees itself as being descended from this aristocracy of ancient Rome. They certainly behave in the manners, shall we say, of all of that. And that's delicious in that regard. But it does suggest that really, from the moment a senator was ready to go in the daytime, he would open the doors, his clients would come in, they would greet him, he would deal with their problems, and then they would escort him, an entourage, all the way down to the forum where he would conduct public business of the day, whatever that might be, and then they would escort him back. Being a Roman senator was a supremely public life. You were never alone, except probably in the evenings if you were home with your family. And so, like I said, these are the landscapes of Roman politics from the house to the forum and back.